Yes. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose Live. My name is Ellie, and I'm a bookseller in the Children and Teens department here. Thank you for joining us and tuning into this format, where we continue to bring authors and new books to you. I am thrilled to welcome our guest this evening, Kenneth C Davis, to celebrate the publication of Strongman, The Rise of Five Dictators and the Fall of Democracy. You can click the link we will drop in the chat to get your own copy at any time during the event, and signed book plates are available while supplies last. If you have a question for our guest, you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and add one there. At the end of the chat, we'll have time to answer some of your questions. You can also vote on questions you'd like and want answered. As always, please remember that this is a creative, safe space, and we ask that folks be respectful of one another in the questions and comments. Now onto the event you're waiting for. Kenneth C Davis is the best-selling author of Don't Know Much About History and the other books in the Don't Know Much About series. He's also the author of two critically acclaimed history books for young people, More Deadly Than War, The Hidden History of the Spanish Flu and the First World War, and In the Shadow of Liberty, The Hidden History of Slavery, Four Presidents, and Five Black Lives. His writing has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times and Newsday. He lives in New York City. And now, without further ado, here is Kenneth C Davis.
Good evening. Thank you, Ellie, and thank you so much for bringing me to Politics and Prose. I have been around the book world and the book publishing world for a very long time, and Politics and Prose, of course, is renowned not only in the book selling world, but in all of America as one of the real landmarks of book selling and writing and the intersection of politics and culture. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here with you tonight. I'm going to do this like this, talk a little bit about myself, my books, and specifically this new book, Strongman. And then we would like to throw it out to you for some questions, comments, thoughts, and they don't have to be limited to the subject at hand. We are obviously living in historic times and on yet another historic day. I'm watching with extraordinary interest, as I'm sure many of you have been. I'm glad they got finished with the business of the day well before 7 o'clock. So we could still have this time together tonight. But let me tell you a little bit about myself if you don't know already. I am best known as the author of this book, Don't Know Much About History, Everything You Need to Know About American History But Never Learned. It was written, I am shocked to say this, and even appalled to say it, 30 years ago. In fact, it was just issued with a new 30th anniversary edition, which includes a preface, a new preface that talks about an era of broken democracy. And the book, if you're not familiar with it, is not a textbook. It's not a school book. It was not written for students. It was actually written for adults who had gone through school and either forgotten what they were supposed to learn, never learned it at all, or learned it all wrong. And that includes a great many people. I have always been a lover of history. I was a lover of history from the time I was a small boy. I was very fortunate. My father, who was a World War II veteran, his idea of summer vacation was to throw us in the back of a car with some World War II Army surplus tents and sleeping bags, and we'd go off to places like Valley Forge and Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, or Gettysburg. So from the time I was a very, very small boy, I always had the sense that history is not something that just happens in books. History happens to real people and real places, and that's the way I always wanted to write about it and speak about it. Don't Know Much About History is written in a series of questions and answers. Some of the questions are pretty straightforward and obvious. Did Christopher Columbus really discover America? What does the Declaration of Independence declare? Then right up to what is Obamacare? In other words, covering some 500 years of American history. The book is written in a question and answer format because, like a lot of people, I'm very curious and I want to answer questions. It was written also in a style that I would say is conversational, just the way I'm speaking to you now, and meant to be accessible. Part of the problem that we have with history is that it's been too much in the ivory tower. the realm of, on one hand, academics who like to write for other academics, or in some cases, the hands of the textbook writers who are writing for, not for the audience that they are intended to write for, but for school boards who are buying textbooks. Don't Know Much About History, as I said, was written for adults, not for children. But over the years, I found an extraordinary number of teachers who were using the book in their classroom. And my later books in the Don't Know Much About series, Don't Know Much About Geography, Don't Know Much About the American Presidents, Don't Know Much About the Civil War. These are all subjects that I thought were important, that we were not well educated enough about, and needed to have some discussion. So that was the essence of my career for a long time. 30 years of asking questions about history and writing books about it, because I always loved history and books and questions. So it seemed like a natural combination. A few years ago, I kind of shifted my attention as a writer to start writing more directly for a young adult audience. I did this in part because I had visited through Skype primarily about 500 classrooms around America and even around some other parts of the world, going in and talking directly to students in their classrooms about history. A lot of that history focused, starting about 10 years ago, on the beginnings of the Civil War. And that, of course, led to conversations about slavery and what slavery meant in American history. And as I talked to these students, as I talked to young people, I found them engaged, interested, curious, a far cry from the way typically students are presented to us in the media today. And I thought that the real way we're going to answer this problem, address this question of the historical illiteracy problem that we have in this country, a problem which carries over into the question of civic engagement, why we as Americans aren't very good at voting. I thought that the only way to do that was really to talk directly to students about history, what it means, how history shapes our lives today, and what the past really has to do with the present. I did that first in a book called In the Shadow of Liberty. It's over there, The Hidden History of Slavery, 4 Presidents and 5 Black Lives. It basically describes the lives, the true, real lives of 5 people who were the possessions, the legal property of 4 of our most famous presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Andrew Jackson. This was a way for me to talk about slavery, this subject that gets reduced to words like proclamations and emancipation and amendments, as opposed to a human story. Slavery is at its heart a human story, and one that is at the center of the great American contradiction that a nation conceived in liberty was also born in slavery. I followed that up with a book about another subject that I was thinking that was left out of my school books, certainly when I was a kid. Slavery was not in my school books, nor was the Spanish flu, the most deadly pandemic in American history up until that date. The Spanish flu and World War I come together. And that's why I wrote More Deadly Than War, which came out 2 years ago, to mark the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the Spanish influenza pandemic, which killed 675,000 Americans in the space of about a year. That's about equal to the number, or surpasses the number, of Americans who died fighting in World War I, World War II, Korea, and the Vietnam War put together, the most deadly pandemic in our history, erased from the history books for the most part. And that's what's always interested me as a historian, telling the stories that the school books leave out, especially stories that are so important to us today. Obviously, when I wrote that book and it was published 2 years ago, a great many people asked me, well, could it happen again? And my answer then was, it's not a matter of could it, it's a matter of when it will happen again. And of course, here we are in the midst of this pandemic, the worst pandemic since the pandemic of 1918. I profess and I believe, and I have written, that we should have learned a lot of lessons from 1918 and applied them to today. I feel that for the most part, those lessons have been largely ignored, overlooked, or forgotten. If we are going to understand history, if we're going to write about and read about history, we have to understand that what happened in the past shapes who we are and where we are today, and it can give us some answers about where we should be going. This is the essence of why we study history. It's not about dates and battles and speeches. And that's what brings me to my latest book, which is called Strongman: The Rise of Five Dictators and the Fall of Democracy. It is a book that looks at how quickly democracy can die. Now, I am a subscriber to the Washington Post. I read it every day. I admire it, but I do not believe that democracy dies in darkness, as the Washington Post motto would have it. History shows, and this history shows, I think, that democracy often dies in broad daylight, decapitated in public while thousands of people cheer, kind of like Ned Stark in Game of Thrones. Spoiler alert. So this is a question for our times, because when I wrote Don't Know Much About History 30 years ago, we were at that moment when the Berlin Wall was being torn down. The Soviet Union was falling apart, collapsing under its own weight. Apartheid had been defeated in South Africa. The Philippines had become a democracy after years of a dictatorship under what they called people power. And around the world, we were looking at this flowering and blossoming of democracy. We thought it was triumphant. But here we are a little bit later, barely 30 years later, and we have seen the return of the strongman, the autocrat, the tyrant, the dictator in many places around the world. And I thought it was really important to focus on how quickly, what democracy is, first of all, what its history is, and how quickly it can vanish. Democracy is a fragile flower, and we are talking about these things even as we speak in this country. So that's why, again, I think it's important to look at history to see how it brought us to where we are and what lessons we can learn from it. Now, in this book, I profile probably five men who are probably the most notorious strongmen in the 20th century. They are in order that I write about them: Benito Mussolini of Italy, Adolf Hitler of Germany, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, Chairman Mao Zedong of China, and finally, Iraq's Saddam Hussein. A lot of people will ask me, well, why these five? Why not others? And there was certainly a large roster of very, very murderous dictators that I could have included in this book. But I thought these five for this particular reason. The first four are pretty self-explanatory. Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, responsible for millions, countless millions of deaths in the time leading up to World War II and during the war itself. Stalin's murderous regime lasting long after the war was over. Chairman Mao, perhaps the most murderous single dictator in history, responsible for the deaths of 40 to 50 million people over his long reign as chairman of the Communist Party in China. And then Saddam Hussein. I included him because Iraq's Saddam Hussein is the strongman who was most involved in recent contemporary American history. He's the only strongman of many that we went to war, the United States went to war with twice. So that's why I focused on these five men in particular. I want to briefly also talk a little bit about the fact that they are men, not monsters. So often we hear a person like a Hitler or a Stalin referred to as monsters. And I want to make this point very clear that they were men. They were human beings, and it's important to remember that. What they did was monstrous, it was murderous. But if we start to think that these people are not ordinary people who do extraordinarily evil things, then we start to lose touch with an important truth, that they are human beings. What's extraordinary in one sense is how ordinary so many of them were, especially as children and even as young men. Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, Mao had rather unusual, very usual childhoods. They were rebellious, perhaps. Mussolini got in trouble in school. He actually stabbed a schoolmate with a penknife. Is that an indication that he would become a murderous dictator? I think not. Adolf Hitler was as a small boy, loved to read stories of the American Old West. And then he had an ambition that was only to go become an artist, a great painter. Stalin was in the seminary school. He later got kicked out, partly because of his revolutionary pamphlets he was reading. And he took a job for a while working as a meteorologist, taking care of making weather recordings every day. Mao Zedong, as a 14-year-old boy, was ordered to marry a woman, an arranged marriage, completely normal in China of its time, and he balked. It was pretty strong indication of a rebellious spirit, but still not an indication of what he was to become. He later on applied for a job in a soap factory and, quite ironically, working for the police department, eventually went to school, became a librarian's assistant before he got deeply involved in the Communist Party at a moment in China's history when the country was really falling apart after centuries and centuries of imperial rule. So in many ways, these five men are very, very ordinary people who then went on to do extraordinary things. And I do want to bring that human quality to this. And I also want to emphasize that when we focus on these five men and what they did, the genocidal plans they created, the murderous, deadly paths they took their countries down, they didn't do it alone. They always had willing accomplices. And that's an important piece of the story as well. It's very easy, I think, to say these kind of trite, simple things like never again. And we saw this and he was a mad dog and we'll never see his like again. Unfortunately, we have seen their like again, and never again has happened many times since, certainly since Hitler. So it's very important for us to understand the history of how these men came to power, how they were able to get their countries in their grasp, and how they were able to lead them down these murderous paths. One of the most important lessons, and it's particularly true in the case of Mussolini and Hitler, the first two stories in the book, that these men did not come to power at the head of an army. These men were both in constitutional democracies. Mussolini was an elected member of parliament when he threatened to bring down the government with a march on Rome. It was a bluff. It was all bluster. He was actually hours away in Milan while his men were supposedly getting ready to march on Rome. And the king of Italy calls him up, fearful of this attempted coup, and offers to make him the prime minister. So without really a shot being fired or any real attempt to overthrow the government, Mussolini was handed the keys to the kingdom. Very important to understand that none of these men could do with it what they did without the complicity of others. Mussolini, of course, then comes into Rome. He takes the sleeper car from Milan down to Rome, and he's greeted as a conquering hero. Within a very short space of time, he took a constitutional democracy and turned it into a one-party state under his fascist party. He soon used violence, corruption, fraudulent elections to cement that rule over Italy and to take it down the path eventually to an alliance with Adolf Hitler. Hitler had actually watched what Mussolini did in 1922 and came back a year later and tried it himself. This was the so-called beer hall push, where Adolf Hitler and his few lieutenants were going to overthrow the government in Bavaria, one of the sections of Germany, in Munich. This plot failed. Hitler was arrested. He was tried for treason. He was sentenced to 5 years, in fact, spent about 9 months in a prison. And during that time, in a prison that looked rather cushy, if one sees a photograph of it, he wrote Mein Kampf. This incident, which should have ended his career, actually created great notoriety for Hitler. So the fact that these men launched coups that were not successful had nothing to do with the fact that eventually they were successful. And in both of these countries, Italy and Germany, working, functioning constitutional democracies were still soon brought to a standstill and turned into murderous dictatorships. So that's one of the important stories that I'm telling in this book, in Strongman, that certainly speaks to our time today. I want to make it very clear that this book does not mention any contemporary American politicians, either those in office right now or recently. It's really a book of history, but it is still a book that teaches us lessons about how a strong man comes to power. In the cases of all these men, I would say there were some key issues. They used a strong nationalist, populist appeal. They wanted to return the former glories of their country. Mussolini pointed back to ancient Rome, the Great Republic, and then the Empire. He actually took a symbol from that time, a symbol of what was carried around by authorities, an item called the fasces, and turned that into the symbol of his party, the Fascist Party. Now, it's interesting to note, if you are watching the proceedings today, right there in the well of the House of Representatives on the wall are two large fasces, sets of rods that are bound together around an axe head. Yes, because the early founding fathers of the United States of America were also great admirers of the Roman Republic. And they knew what the fasces was, that it represented authority, power, strength, and justice to a degree. In fact, there are fasces on this chair of Lincoln Memorial. There are fasces on the statue of George Washington at Federal Hall. There were fasces on the Mercury dime that was produced in this country. So this was a symbol that people understood as a symbol of authority and power. Mussolini took that symbol and made it into his fascist party symbol. This is a story that is important to us today because democracy is under attack around the globe. As I mentioned, 30 years ago or so, we thought we were in a new age where the Soviet Union had disappeared. That was the great fear of my childhood growing up. I was of the generation that had the duck and cover drills. We were marched downstairs to do those nuclear attack drills. Of course, it was rather pointless. I lived just outside of New York City, and we would have been obliterated in seconds, most likely, if there had been a nuclear attack. But that was the era in which I grew up, and then it disappeared. But as I said, we've had this return to authoritarianism, to strong men in places like Russia under Putin, in places like Hungary and Poland, former communist countries that became democracies but have slid backwards. We've seen it in other places, in the Philippines, in South America as well. So we are living in a moment when democracy is under assault around the globe. And that's why it's so important for us to understand how these men come to power. And they have all been men in this case. There are a few examples of women who might fall into the strong man category, but they're very rare. So it's really important, I think, to understand this history. As I said, nationalism and populism are at the core of these men's belief. Hitler said we must bring back the great Reichs of the past. When he said he was in a Third Reich, he was talking about the First Reich being the Holy Roman Empire. Then he was talking about the Reich under Bismarck when Germany came together. And he was going to create the Third Reich, which would last 1,000 years. Others have also used this appeal to nationalism and populism. The next thing these men often do is point to a scapegoat as the reason for their grievances, that it's foreigners, that it's the bankers, that it's one group or another. Ultimately, for Hitler, it became the Jews. For Mussolini, it was the communists and the socialists. And that's one of the reasons that so many people were eager to go along behind him. They feared what was happening in Russia and other places. So they were willing to go along because he had identified this source of fear and he was going to keep it down. They often talk about corruption and restoring law and order. And certainly in Germany and Italy, there was a great deal of disorder. There was chaos. There was political chaos. There was conflict. There was economic chaos and tremendous. We're talking about a period right after World War I. So they were able to take the crisis of the moment and also use that to accrue their power. And finally, they talk about being the only one who can fix this problem, that I alone can fix this, that we need strong leadership that can solve the problems of the country, often by militarizing the country. So these are the techniques that the strongman uses to come into power. And then once in power, there's another set of techniques, a playbook, if you will, that they use. Often it means putting down the press, making the press the enemy of the people, suppressing the courts, indoctrinating a generation of children. Mussolini did this in Italy with a group of children that became devoted to him, and each day they had to learn a set of rules, commandments. And one of those rules was Mussolini is always right. So that's part of this as well. They create a sense of a personality cult. If you went around Italy or Germany, certainly in Mao's China and Saddam's Iraq, you saw pictures of these men everywhere, pictures of them as the father of the country, the leader, the unquestioned leader, and the loyalty was to them. The loyalty was not to an ideal, like all men are created equal, or making a more perfect union. The ideal was the leader represented the country, and loyalty to him must be complete. So there's a very, very complicated and extreme set of techniques that these men use. Chief among them, however, is propaganda. And unfortunately, we are living in a time when propaganda is spread more easily than ever. And this is another lesson from this history. I think it's very, very important to learn. Truth, facts, stubborn facts, as John Adams called them, really do matter. And that's one of the reasons I've worked so hard in these books to try and present real facts about real people doing real things. Sometimes the picture is very, very ugly, and sometimes it's extraordinary, the heroism of some people in resisting the strongman. And that's where I'll conclude before I start to take your questions. And I would like to make this a conversation and not a lecture. One of the things I talk about a lot, especially with younger people, with students, is that you probably have heard and learned that there are 3 ways to respond to bullying in schools, bullying in the classroom. You can be a collaborator. You go along with the bully, sometimes because you go along with them because, gee, if I don't go along with him, I might be next. There's the bystander. The bystander says, well, I don't want to actually punch the kid on the ground, but I'm not going to do anything about it either. So I'm just going to stand back and hope that nobody bothers me. The third response is the upstander. The upstander says, no, you can't do that. You can't bully that person. And this is a lesson that a lot of kids around the country at many different ages are learning: the collaborator, the bystander, the upstander. The same thing happens in dictatorships. Unfortunately, in this book, in Strongman, most of the people who were upstanders, who tried to resist these strongmen, ended up dead or at best expelled from their countries. Mussolini assassinated some of his opposition as soon as he was in power. We know about Hitler's purging of his own men, as well as the purging and murder of any opposition, especially in the press eventually. Same thing with Stalin and Mao, and certainly with Saddam Hussein. So taking the risks to stand up to a dictator involves courage. It involves real dedication to ideas. And that's why I think it's important that we all understand this, because there's always more strength in numbers. One of the things that I talk to students about all the time is our participation in our democracy. And if we want to keep it alive, we must participate in it. And one of the lessons of American history, certainly, is that change has come from the bottom up, not the top down. All of the great social movements, the great changes in our country, abolition, suffrage, the labor movement that reduced child labor eventually and made working conditions decent for people in this country. The movement for civil rights that emerged in the 20th century, and even the anti-war movement of the 1960s. These were all movements that came from the ground up, not the top down. And in almost all of these cases, they came from people who couldn't vote. We talk about the importance of voting, but I think more important is understanding that even when you don't have a vote, you have a voice. And when I was 15, I couldn't vote, but I walked out of school to protest the Vietnam War and what was called the moratorium. I didn't have a vote, but I had a voice. So I think it's really important to understand from this history that we, if we want to defend our democracy, have to use our votes if we have them, but more importantly, to use our voice. And with that, I think I'm going to be quiet for a few minutes and turn this back over to Ellie and see if we have some questions, comments for you. And certainly if you want to discuss what's going on in the country, it obviously relates to what we're talking about in this book. And I'm happy to go along with that, as well as talking about the subject of any of my other books. So please, Ellie, let's get to it and have the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I definitely appreciate your words here. Thank you for everything you said. We do have some really good questions from the audience here. I'm going to start with one from Donna Howard, and it says, how has society successfully gotten out from under the thumb of dictators? As we know, disinformation and propaganda results in a portion of the population being brainwashed. Have other societies found ways to counter this?
I missed the very beginning of that question.
Oh,
if you
sorry about that.
That's
yeah,
okay.
no worries. How have societies successfully gotten out from under the thumb of dictators?
Well, unfortunately, in the case of these stories, most of the dictators who came, who eventually were removed or overthrown, was the result of very, very long, deadly wars. Certainly Mussolini and Hitler both come to their ends through World War II. And certainly Saddam Hussein, the same thing. The second war against by the United States against Iraq ends up in his capture and eventual execution by the Iraqi authorities. In Stalin and Mao's case, however, we have a very different situation. Both of them lived a long time in virtual complete control over not only their countries, but a large and growing empire. In the case of the Soviet Union, of course, not only the USSR itself, but the Eastern Bloc countries of Hungary, Poland. You can go down the list, the Iron Curtain countries. So those situations, the Soviet Union ultimately comes to an end in the early 1990s, replaced briefly by a republic, which has now since been replaced by another authoritarian, Vladimir Putin. China, of course, Mao lives a long time, dies, and his communist regime continues on after him. Much different from anything Mao certainly could have imagined, but still the most, perhaps the most repressive authoritarian regime on the face of the earth right now, with the exception perhaps of North Korea. So there isn't always a happy ending to these stories, and there isn't an end of how societies are rid of dictators in every case. Certainly Italy and Germany suffered grievously in a war that brought them to their knees, and both eventually became modern democracies under a parliamentary system, and have had mixed success over the years. Germany more so than Italy, I suppose, which seems to struggle with a great many political issues. But I think there's a bigger question, perhaps, that, and I'm grateful for the question, a bigger question of which is, how do we deal today with this issue of propaganda? Because I really do think it's one of the most pressing and urgent questions that we face as a society. The notion that reality, truth, objective facts are all being questioned at the highest levels of government and the highest levels of media makes it difficult for anyone to understand what truth is. So I think we're in the midst of a real great reckoning. Now, all of these things always existed before. All of these strongmen were very, very good at propaganda. They understood propaganda. Certainly Hitler talked about the big lie as his minister of propaganda did. But what's changed, of course, in our own time is the incredible power of the media, the television and press media, as well as even more powerful social media. And this is a real reckoning for the country. And I don't think, I certainly don't have an easy answer. One thing I would say is that a great many students I talk to and a great many teachers I talk to are actually more aware of media literacy, as we might call it, than a lot of their parents might be. And so I'm a little bit more optimistic, certainly, about younger people understanding the images and the messages they are getting than I am about some of the adults in this country who really have taken an awful lot of what they are presented hook, line, and sinker. And we're seeing it in terms of not only our politics, but in terms of the pandemic. So this is a really grave issue for the country to deal with, for the world to deal with. How do we get back to a fact-based, reality-based set of ideas, facts, thoughts that we can agree to disagree on?
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. It sort of brings me to a question I had, which was, and I know you sort of answered this already, but if we see in your last chapter, you have sort of a bulleted blueprint for the making of a dictatorship, which you touched on. And how do you think people who might see one rising, especially young people, how do you think that we should respond?
I think that, I write in the book, and I wrote this after having written a book about the pandemic, but before the pandemic, this pandemic struck, that I believe that dictatorship is like, in a way, it's also something we get sick from. It's something that that can make the society sick. And just as we need to vaccinate now against a virus, we need to vaccinate against the virus of authoritarianism, and that's partly against the virus of false information and propaganda. So how do we do that? It certainly starts with education. It certainly starts with people becoming educated consumers of information. What does that mean? I think in terms of the strongman, when you hear a leader talking about the country has been downtrodden because of one group or another, and we can certainly single out from recent experience, this country was brought down because Mexico wasn't sending its best, and their Muslims and immigrants are destroying this country. For Hitler, it was another set. Foreigners, the bankers, and the Jews were destroying the country. When you hear a leader singling out and expressing grievances as being the problem caused by a single soul group, and this has been true throughout our history. I'm not just singling out what happened in the past 5 years here. Once upon a time, the dirty, dangerous immigrants were Irish Catholics in this country. It's always been true that we've pointed to the other as the cause of the problem. We had exclusion acts to keep out Asians. We had laws that said no Irish need apply. We've had bloody insurrections that relate to religion, fighting Catholics, burning of convents, the Bible riots in Philadelphia in 1844. These are things I've written about in some of my other books. So this is part of our political DNA. And so I think if you want to be on guard, you must first watch for that as a signal. When somebody is saying the cause of our problems, the root cause of our problems is that group, that's one hint that you're dealing with somebody who has strongman tendencies. If someone says, we are in such a corrupt mess because of that group and what's going on, that only I can repair this, that we need a single strong leader who can bring the nation together to defeat this, that's also to me a signal of strongman tendencies. If you hear then things like the press is the enemy of the people, that the political opponent should not just be defeated, but put in jail, those are warning signs, in my mind, of the potential strongman. So I think you can go down the list that I include in the back of the book, the list that I call the strongman's playbook, and see, is this person that I'm listening to saying this kind of thing? Is he saying that we have to get rid of the courts? Is he saying we have to get rid of the press? Is he saying that this is true and that's a big lie and only my truth is true? So these are really difficult questions for our time. And again, I point to the fact that a lot of teachers are working very hard at this in their classrooms, trying to teach media literacy. But we are flooded when we look at the computer, when we do research with misinformation. So it's really an education process that has to start early on in school and continue, but it's also an education process that has to affect adults as well. And the best, I guess the best antidote, the best vaccine is more education and more reliable information, and finding the sources that you can really trust that document that what they are saying as true. And this is really the problem for our time.
Absolutely, thank you. And I appreciate what you said earlier about movements being from the ground up. And I think that a lot of the answers we're looking for can be found in what a lot of movement leaders today are saying, which is
Well, let me follow up
Yeah.
on that very briefly because I say this with complete honesty. One of the things that makes me most optimistic these days is seeing young people involved in extraordinary movements. There's no question that the climate crisis movement is being led in many ways by young people. Obviously, specifically, one young person has made an extraordinary name for herself, but she has a legion of young followers who recognize that what she's saying is true, and they are taking action to do something about it. I participated in the last climate action strike here in New York City. It's a couple of years ago already, and I was astonished at seeing the number of very young people, children, students, who were out in the streets, but they were there with their mothers and their grandparents, but they were more leading than going along with, and that gives me great hope. So the climate crisis, I think the gun safety laws are being challenged, especially by the survivors of the Parkland tragedy. And in many ways, the Black Lives Matter movement has been led by young people in this country. So that encourages me to know that these people have listened to their history teachers and understand that there is, as John Lewis called it, good trouble. And this is part of our right as Americans to use our voices, even when we don't have a vote, as I mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one or two more questions. One is from Hisham Musa, and it's, why don't we see dictators get ousted by their own party more often? And how does the culture of the country play a part in allowing a dictator to take hold?
Why don't we see more dictators getting ousted by their own party? That's a good one. And I think that, if we look at some of the situations around the world and point to some of the current dictators, for instance, the leader of Hungary, he was confronted by a coup a few years ago and moved very quickly to dismantle any opposition, purged the courts, purged the army, purged the teaching profession of people who were not loyal to him. So when you have someone who is able to marshal complete loyalty within his party, that is the signal that this is somebody who's not going to be easily overthrown. I tell the story in the last chapter about Saddam Hussein, of his getting all of his generals and leaders into a group, and then he singles out a few of them, and they're taken out and shot. And he says, well, these men were conspiring against me. Are you with me, or are you against me? And of course, that inspires the kind of loyalty that does not easily get overturned. So these men have tremendous power, which they are willing to share only with those who are completely loyal to them. So the question of loyalty to this single person becomes the test. And of course, we know, for instance, that late in the war, there were attempts on Hitler's life. There were attempts on Mussolini's life over the course of the years. They were usually put down, and it usually resulted in more purges of the dangerous, of the threats. Obviously, Stalin was the great master of this and filled up the gulags with people who opposed him, including people who were seemingly loyal communists. And of course, in the most notorious case early on, as he was establishing his control over the country, he eliminated his greatest rival, Trotsky, who leaves the country and was eventually later assassinated in Mexico. So this is, it's ruthlessness. And as George Orwell pointed out, and Orwell was so wise, the point of power is power. The point of a dictatorship is dictatorship. That's why there are revolutions, to create a dictatorship. And then ultimately it's to get that power and cement that power. And those who would object to it, the upstanders in some cases, or those who might oppose it, are often dealt with ruthlessly. I write about, for instance, the teenagers in Nazi Germany of the White Rose movement who saw what was happening, especially late in the war, and tried to get the German people to listen to them, that Hitler was taking them to a disaster. And of course, they were all caught, captured, tried, and quickly executed. So that is the price sometimes of being the upstander. And the same thing holds true for people who may not like the supreme leader, but cannot overcome the threat of violence that he presents to them.
Thank you so much for your answer. Yeah, it's definitely a sobering quandary when people command that amount of loyalty. Our next and possibly final question is from Leah Medvin, and it's, is there a time when it is appropriate to hold a strongman accountable through prosecution without damaging democracy?
I think that it's an extremely appropriate time to use, if you get into a situation where the rule of law can hold such men accountable. Absolutely, it's a very, very good thing. And we can see that perhaps, I guess, in the case of these five men, best in the case of Saddam Hussein, who was overthrown by a military intervention. Eventually, a form of democracy was instituted into Iraq, and the Iraqi people, not the United States, tried and executed Saddam Hussein. So, and of course, that is a country that's still in considerable turmoil. I certainly don't think it's, the perfect democracy by any stretch yet, but we are far from the reign of terror that was under Saddam Hussein, who, by the way, went by the name Stalin on the Tigris. And that's the title of the chapter of the book, because, and one of the reasons also that I included Saddam in this book is that he studied Stalin. His library, when they found it, was filled with books about Stalin. He modeled himself on Stalin. And of course, that means modeling yourself on one of the most ruthless, murderous men in all of history. So these men have connections to each other that go down, and that's one of the reasons I included all of these men. But yes, I think that we have to hope that civic authority, the rule of law, eventually supersedes the rule of the strongman. It doesn't always happen, and I'm not sure it eventually happens. 2,500 years ago, and I talk about the beginnings of democracy in Greece in the book, Plato said that democracy would inevitably fall to a tyrant. He didn't believe that democracy was the best form of government, and that a tyrant would eventually come along and supplant democracy. I'm a little bit more optimistic than that, but we're seeing that struggle play out right now around the world and to some degree in this country. So I wish I could be more optimistic than I am. And I am constantly hopeful, though, that the country will be in a better place down the road than we are in right now, both in terms of the pandemic and the political situation.
Yeah. Hope is definitely at a premium these days. I think Rachel Chapman has a really good question to end us on, and it's, I love your writing style for YA. The topics of your last 3 books have been quite varied. I wonder, how did you get the idea to research and write on this topic in particular, and what might be your next book? What might your next book be about?
Each of these books was really motivated by my watching, in a sense, what was going on around me, and also my feeling that these were stories left out of school books and history books. And that's been a theme throughout my career of writing history. Specifically, I tried to touch on this when I started talking. I saw this era of fading democracy both around the world and to some degree in the United States. And I really felt that to explain who these men were, because we all know the names Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, we've heard them, we know kind of what they did, but I think that too many people don't truly understand how they came to power and how they were able to destroy any sense of hope of democracy in their countries. So it's really a book that was written out of my sense of warning and fear that we had forgotten the lessons of history, and we better pick up open our eyes and be sure that we're going in the direction we want to go in. But I love writing books for young people. But here's the dirty little secret of writing books for young people. My books for younger readers are really not much different than my books for older readers. They're a little shorter, they're more illustrated, and the type is a little bit bigger. And guess what? Most adults love that too. So I have found over the past few years of writing these books aimed at a younger adult audience that a great many adults pick them up not knowing they are aimed at young adults and reading them and enjoying them. And part of my reason for doing that is I speak to young people, I hope you hear it tonight, with the same sense of respect and care that I would speak to an older adult audience. I don't believe in this idea of making things simpler for kids or anything like that. I try and talk to people in an accessible, conversational style and present facts and document those facts. And that's what I think is, it's true whether I'm writing for adults or young adults. And part of that also is I want this to be a conversation between adults and young adults so that parents and students and teachers can read these books together and talk about them. I've had so many people over the years, especially with In the Shadow of Liberty, talk about how this book really enabled them to have a dinner table conversation about slavery for the first time in their house, because kids brought these books home and their parents also didn't know the story because they had been left out of their history books. They didn't know that presidents kept slaves. There are many people who still don't acknowledge that basic fact. So this is partly a way for an intergenerational conversation about these very, very important subjects.
Thank you so much. It looks like we are just out of time. That was perfect timing. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights, and thank everyone who submitted a question, even if we didn't get to it, for your questions. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Don't forget, you can still click the link in the chat box to get your copy of Strongman. And to find out about more events, please go to our website for updated listings. You can also follow our Children and Teens Department on social media. The handle is posted in the chat. And you can watch our past events on our Politics and Prose YouTube channel. Thank you everyone again. Please keep reading widely and expanding your world, and stay safe. Thank you so much.